for praying. We're going to turn in our Bibles now to the Gospel of John, the 9th chapter. In this chapter, we're going to read just the first 12 verses, but we're going to be ambitious today and look at the chapter in its entirety because it has a wonderful teaching for us. So, would you open your Bible, please, to John chapter 9, and we'll introduce the passage by starting there. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same guy that used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. My prayer this morning is that if you are asked, "Where is this Jesus?" that you don't respond in the same way, but instead say, "I know about him." Today we must open our eyes and our hearts to see God at work. One morning while Mom and Pop were seated at the breakfast table, the doorbell rang. It took a moment for the older couple to hear it. The husband said over his paper, "The doorbell is ringing." The wife reluctantly got to her feet and went to the door. Opening it, she saw a man standing outside. He was holding a clipboard, and his shirt said, "Best Blinds." The man said, "I'm here for the Venetian blind." The woman excused herself in a preoccupied way, went to the kitchen, dug out some quarters from the loose change jar, and returned to the door. She gently pressed them into the man's hand, then gently closed the door and returned to the table. "Somebody collecting for a foreign charity," she said. She poured more coffee. Get it? Venetian blind. You know, I can't afford a staff of joke writers. I mean, this is as good as it gets. You just have to live with it. I offer that joke to illustrate how misunderstandings occur, especially when we aren't looking. Let's open our eyes today to Jesus' teaching about sight. We're going to see today 3 kinds of blindness. Now, we're not going to have very much time to spend on any of these, so get your track shoes on, get your message notes ready, and let's see what God teaches us. The first kind of blindness is a metaphorical or symbolic kind, mental blindness or ignorance. And we see this at the beginning of chapter 9. Jesus and the disciples have just left the temple, and they're walking about, and they spy this beggar at the temple courts. And he is known in the city as a man who had been born blind. And as we all do, the disciples struggle to understand this tragic circumstance. Someone born unable to see. Let's think for a moment about their question. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? First of all, it's evidence of a common human failing, and that is when something goes wrong, we engage in fault finding. We want to know who to blame, and that seems to be our first response whenever there's a problem. Let's look at the question in halves. The first half of the question sounds ludicrous. How could an unborn baby be guilty of any sin, let alone a sin worthy of this kind of punishment? It sounds crazy to us, but there is some evidence of it in Scripture and in the Jewish culture of the day. In Scripture, in Psalm 51:15, David wrote, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." So David pondered the possibility of being sinful even before birth. Jewish teachers of the time thought that if a woman was expecting and she committed the sin, that part of the guilt also was accrued to the baby within her. So they're not asking this question way out of left field. It's something that was addressed in their culture, in their religious faith. The other half of the question sounds unfair. If the parents sinned, why punish the child? The second commandment that the Lord gave way back in Exodus chapter 20 is to not make any idols. And he backs up that commandment with this statement: "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." Later on in this passage in verse 34, the Pharisees, the religious and civil leaders of that society, accused the blind beggar of being steeped in sin at birth. So again, the question is not way out of left field. It's not out of the ordinary. The disciples were struggling to understand, and so they asked a question that made sense to them. It's still the wrong question. Because the focus is not on God where it belongs, but the focus is on the people. It's on the baby, and it's on the parents, when he should be asking, what might God have in mind here? Jesus explained to them in his answer that the ultimate reason for human suffering is for God to be at work. Now, folks, I want us to center in on this. This is the key of the entire passage. Look at verses 3 to 5. Jesus said, "I tell you, it's not for this man's sin, it's not for his parents' sin that this man is suffering, but so that the work of God might be displayed in his life." And I want to tell you today, friends, every circumstance you and I face, that is the undercurrent of every one of them. You say, "God, what are you doing?" And God says, "I am displaying my work in your life." Wow. Everything that happens to us is an act of grace by God in an attempt to make himself known through you and I. Jesus explained that he was the light of the world, and there wasn't much time left in his ministry, so the light had to shine while it could, and he was trying to shine his light on them to illuminate them and get them to understand that God is at work all the time. So the first kind of blindness is mental blindness. It's ignorance, and it can be willful ignorance, or it can be simply we haven't heard the truth yet. The second kind of blindness is physical blindness, the inability to physically see. Notice what Jesus did here in relation to this man. He used an unusual means of bringing healing to this blind Now, when you read through the Gospels, what will strike you is that as Jesus performed miracles, the means of the miracles are as individual as the persons who received them. So, for example, I don't think you'll find any other place in the Gospels where Jesus made mud to fix somebody. Usually we make mud because we're gardening or we're trying to do something fun or make mud pies. But in this case, Jesus used it to heal the man. Now just imagine for a second if you're blind and you're sitting there listening to Jesus, and then suddenly something wet is pushed onto your face. Ew! Would be my reaction. What are you doing? And I believe here Jesus required the man to wash because it was an act of obedience. In other parts of the gospel, Jesus merely spoke and blindness was healed. Why not do the same here? I think there was something in this man's heart, this man's soul, that Jesus said, he needs to obey me first. And so he put mud on his eyes and sent him to the pool of Siloam. Now, John thought it was important that we know that the word Siloam means sent. So, Jesus sent him to the place named Sent. And once he had gone where he was sent and washed his face as he was told, and parents, you know how that works sometimes. Wash your face. Behind the ears, he could see. And not surprisingly, the first thing he wanted to do when he received his sight was to behold the faces of his parents whom he had never seen. Wow. Imagine being the mom and dad and Sonny comes home. He walked himself home. And he says he can see. Well, that's going to cause quite a stir in the neighborhood, isn't it? And we come to that next. So we've seen mental blindness, we've seen physical blindness, now we're going to see third, volitional blindness, or the refusal to see, the refusal to recognize the truth when it is in front of us. And we see this in two different people, or two different sets of people in John's Gospel passage. We see it first in the neighbors of the blind man. Mom and Dad were shouting and praising God, and they were standing out in front of the house and celebrating the fact that Junior could see. For the first time in his life, he could really see. And some of the neighbors refused to believe. They refused to believe it. We talk about selective hearing. Well, there's such a thing as selective seeing, too. Look at verse 9. Some recognized him, others denied him. No, it only looks like him. You know, just can't picture that. Wow, why do you want to be so negative? No, it only looks like him. I am the man, he said, with maybe a little bit of frustration. It is me. Do you ever wish people would stop and listen to themselves? Oh, it only looks like him. Yeah, that just sounds ridiculous. And if they really stop and listen to themselves, they think, oh, golly, why did they say that? It's just silly. He's standing right in front of you. You can't deny it. He was blind, but now he can see. The evidence is there. Don't think that if you ignore it, he'll go away. The other group was the Pharisees. And all they could see was a violation of the Sabbath laws. This situation caused such a ruckus, and since there were some who refused to believe, the naysayers gathered up the parents and the blind man and took him to the religious authorities of the day, the Pharisees. And they said, you know, we got some of our neighborhood says that this is the blind guy, the blind beggar who couldn't see, and now he does, and some of us don't believe it. Can you figure this out for us? So they tell him the story. They said, in effect, wow, this is the first century. Nobody believes in miracles anymore. And that's so old-fashioned. And when you read verses 13 to 34, it's almost comical the way this whole thing pulls off. It's ridiculous. In fact, in verse 28, the Pharisees resort to name-calling. And as typical with hypocrites, they didn't care much about the man's healing. They didn't really care that he was born blind, but now he could see. What they were stressed about was the fact that Jesus had spit on the ground and made some mud. You see, making mud is a violation of the Sabbath prohibition against work. Wow. Talk about missing the point. Talk about not seeing the big picture. They were mad because Jesus had made mud on the Sabbath. Now, I think he might have done it just for that reason. I'm not saying Jesus was a troublemaker. And even though to ours this sounds very petty, and it is also serious business, because these men could have barred that man and his family from ever entering the temple to worship. And even worse, they could have had him beat up by the temple guards for what they saw as this infraction of their law. Now, they couldn't do anything, really. I mean, the guy was standing there. They all knew who he was. They all had seen him many times sitting outside the gate of the temple with his little tin cup. His little sign says, "I'm blind, please help." So they just threw him out. That was the end of it. Jesus then condemned this spiritual blindness. Look at verses 35 to 41. Word gets out that the man had been taken to the Pharisees, that they had washed their hands of him, and so Jesus seeks him out, and he goes to the man, and he wants to know what happened. And he identifies himself as the one who had done this great work to this man, because this man hadn't seen him either. Remember? He was blind. His eyes were covered with mud. It was only after he washed that he could see. And Jesus wasn't at the pool. So he's seeing Jesus for the first time. And he says in verse 38, "Lord, I believe." 3 simple words. Lord, I believe. Imagine what went into that statement. A lifetime of blindness. Relieved. Lord, I believe. Jesus received his confession with an explanation of his mission. And he says in verse 39, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. For judgment I have come into this world." That's stern. And apparently some Pharisees had followed the blind man. And once again, they're saying things that no adult person should say out loud. What? Are we blind too? Well, yeah. But yours is a decision to be blind. And so Jesus said to them, if you were blind, physically, you would not be guilty of sin. This man was not guilty of sin. He was blind physically, but he's not guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Just kind of a left-handed way of saying, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, you're blind. The Pharisees, we need to understand, had spent their entire lives studying Scripture and the hundreds of interpretations that applied Scripture to everyday life. They believed they knew it all, and they believed that they kept it all. And so for Jesus to stand there and tell them that they're blind, mentally and spiritually, wow. They were guilty of a willful, intentional blindness. Friends, we must open our eyes and our hearts to see God at work. We've seen the three kinds of blindness here, and I want to tell you the most horrifying one is spiritual blindness. Faith requires looking at the world in a different way. It requires putting off what the world tells us is common sense. It requires us putting off a scientific worldview. It involves adopting God's point of view first and foremost. It's a change of mind where we seek wisdom from His Word and from His Spirit. Faith requires us to tear down the idols of self and all the other material things that vie for our affection and our attention, and to build an altar to God in our hearts. Faith is looking at ourselves and our world with eyes that were once blind but now can see. As we grow and mature in our faith, God gives us increasing sensitivity to what is actually true, what is truly important, what is worth expending our lives upon. And so I say to you, open your eyes. God is at work. We have only to look to see. Amen? We're going to open our eyes, our hearts, and our voices to worship the